In a way, this game represents a transition in the gaming industry, away from the traditional 3D collectathon platformer pioneered by the likes of Mario 64. Well, maybe not this game, but its sequel. But I may be getting ahead of myself. Let's define what I'm talking about first. If you look at the blueprint Mario 64 laid out, you get something like this. Character explores levels, connected by a hub world to collect certain items that are needed to progress, and additional items that assist progression, unlock secrets, or enhance the experience in some way. You do not have to collect every item to complete these games, but the sheer volume means that you can collect what you need from various sources. Collecting everything often results in some sort of completion bonus, or at least a feeling of catharsis that you have completed it. To properly build one of these games, you need a balance between the amount of collectible items and the variety of difficulty for the individual levels. Levels are not there to be beaten. You don't climb the flagpole at the end. They're sandboxes that the player traverses through to find the required items to progress. Death in these games usually entails the resetting of a player's progress towards an immediate goal. The player can then choose to re-attempt or move to another objective. The player is never gated by the inability to complete a single task, and can swap objectives based on their own skill level and preferences. There are many other vital steps in the evolutionary chain of this style of game. Banjo-Kazooie, Conker's Bad Fur Day, all the way to Donkey Kong 64. Rare and Nintendo dominated this style of gameplay through the N64 era, and even Nintendo is one of the few companies still carrying on the torch today. However, some indie developers have taken a crack at it. DK64's extreme number of collectibles had players questioning the relevancy of this formula going forward. You may love Donkey Kong 64, but I don't think anybody would argue that there is a lot of collectibles in that game. Sometimes you can have too much of a good thing. But around the time of the PS2 generation, things were changing. But before these types of games took a hiatus for a little while, Naughty Dog took an honest crack at it and pretty much showed everyone what one of these games could have been in the 6th generation of consoles. Coming off their success with the Crash Bandicoot series, Naughty Dog lost the rights to the character when their partnership with publisher Universal Interactive ended. They began working on their new IP under the codename Project Y, with only 2 developers working on the project while the rest of the studio finished Crash Team Racing. After they were purchased by Sony, game development began in earnest with a budget of $14 million. The game was slated to release on the upcoming then PlayStation 2. With the higher horsepower, the developers wanted to build a seamless world with no paintings or load times. Even with the hardware, this was quite the challenge, and the team used some very clever tricks to pull it all off without any of the fog that had been traditionally used in large open-world style games on the N64 and PlayStation 1. When it came to design, the whole team pitched in with ideas for the environment and characters. Initially, 3 main characters were planned, with a third pet-like character, like a Chow from the Sonic Adventure series. In the end, though, the traits of these 3 characters were combined and streamlined. Jack is our, at current, silent protagonist. He does the heavy lifting, like the platform and the combat, whereas Daxter is the loudmouth animal sidekick.
I thought that's one of your vital organs. Walk it off, tough guy.
Daxter is turned into an Ottsel, a weasel combined with an otter, by a heavy dose of dark eco in the beginning of the game. And the duo sets off with the initial goal of healing Daxter.
Man, that stung. I told you we shouldn't have come here, and you listened. What?
What is eco? Well, we can circle back to that in a bit, but I wanted to talk more about the character designs before I moved on with the story. I like the direction taken with most of the cast. There was a hybrid approach applied to make the characters appealing in Japan and America. Both Western and Eastern influences are apparent in these characters' appearances and wardrobe. Characters feel very animated, and that is to be expected considering the context. Outside animators from the studio were brought in from places like Disney to do the character animation. Characters have real weight to their movements, and it's not often present in this particular era of video games. Jak and Daxter's interactions have a lot of life in them, and characters are very expressive. However, the two main female characters in particular have not aged well. If the office staff contributed to each character design, then these two were designed by the 13-year-old boy playtesters from the 90s. So what is Eco? Eco is the mystical, elemental substance that powers the world. There are several types: green, yellow, red, blue, dark, and light. Each has an elemental affinity, except for dark and light. Light only appears at the end, but it's a combination of the other elements. Each type, except for light, has a sage associated with it, and the sage of the dark eco has decided to use it to take over the world. To do this, he needs to open the dark eco silos so he can flood the world and rebuild it in his image. Also, as already mentioned, he has a sister who feels extra redundant due to her design, and she doesn't really... You could have had one of these villains, you didn't need both of them, and honestly, his design is a lot more creative, and hers is a lot more cliche. As far as villains go, they come in and out of the story as necessitated to drive the plot along. The game is a series of connecting hub worlds that are gated by the number of power cells needed to unlock them. But there are no loading zones between levels or zones, as I already mentioned, which is amazing for this console generation. I'm not saying that loading zones bother me, but it is certainly an asset to the immersion to remove them. The world itself is full of life and detail. Adding to this detail are various NPCs, all with incredible designs and quirky personalities. You will explore swamps, ancient ruins, volcanic basins, dark caverns, and frozen peaks. Complementing the platforming are short, interconnected vehicle segments that come in two varieties. There are the Zoomer-related challenges that are much like speeder bikes from Star Wars. The vehicle is a little floaty in its physics, which sometimes leads to frustrations. The large bird is my preferred of the two, featuring fast movement but tighter controls. However, this mechanic is far less prevalent, and I wish there were a few more moments in the game where you could ride the bird instead of the Zoomer. I like the use of both in general though, as they provide a great variety to the gameplay. Most of the time, you're going to be doing the good old-fashioned platforming. So how does it hold up? Well, not exactly what I would call tight. With the increased focus on Jak's animation, the trade-off is that the player is left with slow-moving character that's a bit harder to control. Now, it's not deal-breaking, but compared to something like Banjo-Kazooie or Mario, you never have that same level of precision or control. To make up for this, Jak has some more options to extend his hang time to compensate. This gives the player more time to execute precision platforming. It helps enormously, but brings up another shortcoming, at least in my view. And I'm a little different. Mario 64 is, in my opinion, the best one of these games that is made and ever will be made, so I'm a bit old-fashioned in my thinking. Jak is kind of slow, so his jumps do not have quite the momentum that Mario or Banjo have. So I found that many of my jumps felt like they came up short. But again, I feel reluctant to blame this on the game. It's likely just me being used to Mario 64 since I play that game all the time. My muscle memory works against me. The platforming is built soundly around Jak's moveset. I guess you could say I would prefer if he moved a little faster and jumped a little higher and further, but that's more personal preference. I imagine the speed and height were chosen specifically because of the desire to have Jak's animations play out. And if that was the case, then I would say they made the right call. Jack's animations are stunning, utilizing a lot of techniques like squash and stretch to give them a cartoon-like feel. In addition to the jump mechanic, there are a couple of other options. Jack can crouch, and when he's in crouch position, he can utilize a high jump. He can roll out of the crouch to perform a long jump. There's a punch, which can be followed up by an uppercut. Then there is also the spin attack, which I already mentioned, which is used to attack, but also to slow down that jump so you can kind of helicopter in the air and make precision decisions on your landing spots. However, not all these moves are always available. Jack can only double jump and spin at certain heights in the jump, and once he falls a certain distance, you essentially lose all control. I died a lot trying to use the double jump or the spin to slow down, but I did it too late in the jump. I would have personally preferred always having access to these jump extensions, but it's not a deal breaker. It would not have been much of a collectathon without things to collect, so let's look at them. The main collectible tied to progression is the Power Cell. There are 75 that are required to beat the game, but if you collect all 101 of them, you unlock a special ending teasing the intro to the sequel. Power Cells are rewards for completion of challenges in levels, beating bosses, and trading them for Precursor Orbs with the locals. The Precursor Orbs act as a currency in the game. Each level has a maximum number to collect and trade. Each level also has scout flies, which function like red coins in Mario, as collecting them all in a level yields a power cell. These three collectible options closely mirror the Super Mario 64 collection system. It does not fall into the trap of including excessive collectibles to pad out the game's length. It does not reinvent the wheel, but fine-tunes it. Collection of these items is not just tied to player progression, but to small tangible rewards that give the player an immediate satisfaction. For example, each power cell collected is accompanied by different animations from Jack and Daxter celebrating. These are all quick, but an excellent reward, and then the game resumes right where you left off. My favorite animation is when Jack alley-oops the orb to Daxter and he dunks it. It's just fantastic. The game just looks and sounds great. The music has a very tribal feel with drums and gives that game a connection to Naughty Dog's roots, sounding very similar to Crash Bandicoot's OST, but more grounded. Voice acting is top-notch, with Daxter being an outstanding addition. I was concerned all these years later that Daxter's quips would feel a bit dated, but Max Casella's performance of the character is very solid, and even 20-something years later, I laughed and smiled almost every time Daxter was on screen.
Wait a minute! That was Gull? The same Gull who's supposed to change me back? Gull is the guy trying to kill us? I'm doomed.
But even the NPCs get some incredible voice work, and the animations bring their performances to life.
I would have pledged my word that I had 90 of them, but I gather that your young friend, the little annoying, miserably ugly one, might have just pilfered them as a sort of a spot of fun.
The game story is set up well, and the inciting incident is more in-depth than the standard damsel in distress. Jack and Daxter set out to turn Daxter back into a human, or whatever they are. And as the journey goes on, the stakes escalate and the urgency of their adventure ramps up. It does not quite have the compelling personal stakes of its sequel, but just having a narrative this rich with NPCs was one of its innovations to the genre. Honestly, not every story has to be compelling to be entertaining, and it's refreshing to experience a story that remembers that entertaining is important. It's a solid canvas to paint the characters and motivations on, and it does its job of driving the player forward while not taking the focus off of what the game is really about. Solid animation, immersive world building, and fun, challenging platforming. I honestly do not have a lot of complaints about Jak and Daxter, as it's just a solid platforming experience from beginning to end. And I know I mentioned the slower movement speed, but honestly the game is designed around Jak's moveset so well that the only reason it stands out to me, again, is because I've just played so much Mario 64 in my life that it's probably ruined me. But the experience is so solid that when I played the sequel, I was surprised that it changed direction so drastically. I played and beat the sequel back in the day, but I've not replayed it since. And I've never picked up and played Part 3 despite owning a copy. But I come back and play this first game often, and I think it's because I really like the direction they took in iterating the formula laid down by the games that I loved growing up, like Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie. With the increased emphasis on the narrative and the more animated and detailed world, it felt like it was heralding in a new generation of these games that I really loved. So when the sequel moved in a different direction, I was disappointed. Not because it was bad, it was excellent. I really enjoyed it. The game, by itself, I really enjoyed. But it's not really what I wanted. I'm not going to hold that against Naughty Dog. They make great games. But I wanted more of this. And not just from them, but from the industry as a whole. And for a long time, this type of game was kind of left in the dust. I mentioned Banjo, but even the Bear and Birds next game was not a platformer. For a while, Mario was the only one carrying this torch, and while I love Mario, it's nice to have diversity and variety. I love this game, but it makes me sad in a way because it represents a transition away from the games that I grew up loving. I'm glad that they have had a semi-resurgence of late, but when I play this game I often think of what might have been if we as gamers hadn't suddenly decided that this was beneath us or that we were too old to play these kind of games. If we hadn't had that edgy attitude awakening that we had as gamers during the time period. I don't know. I always imagine an alternate world where Jak and Daxter, the Precursor Legacy Part 2 took me on another platforming adventure. But I'm not going to complain, because I can go back and play this game and its sequels and have a good time anytime I want to. And as a personal recommendation, I would say Jak and Daxter, the Precursor Legacy is absolutely worth playing today. Thanks for watching. And as always, I hope you all have a wonderful day.